Hi everybody, so welcome to the session 3D Printing a New Industrial Revolution, question mark. We've got about 55-60 minutes, probably enough time for the 3D printer to print a gun, if you can. Outside, there's a guy called Martin Stevens from a company called It Is 3D, and he's also doing demonstrations where you can even get your face or head scanned, and depending on how big your head is, you can print it out in 20 minutes or longer. So you might like to try that out after this session. I'd like to just quickly thank Paul Reeves on my right, who is really the producer of this session, and he's put together, I think, a really good panel of speakers and hopefully a good ensuing debate. This is an in-conversation, so we have about sort of 55-60 minutes, and there's no speaker introductions as such, but I'm going to do a very quick, brief synopsis of what I think the whole 3D printing debate is. I'm going to bring in the panel, who I'll introduce very shortly, and kind of get a sort of debate going, a warm-up debate, shall we say, and then hopefully 30 minutes or so, I want yourselves to also add your 2 pence worth to what you think the impact of 3D printing is, or not is, as the case may be, sorry. And I want you to kind of think about it in terms of questions, raise your own points and debate, because the idea of this session is really to try and get behind the hype of what 3D printing is being presented as in terms of how we understand today. So first of all, speaker introductions. For the full kind of blown biographies, do go to the conference or festival website. But on my immediate right here, we've got James Buchanan. He's a prototype technology specialist, Jaguar Land Rover, advises and educates engineers and designers on prototype technology. Part of his role also includes researching and prototyping technology, primarily focusing on rapid prototyping and most recently with the new desktop 3D printing market. Andrew Keane, on my furthest right, he's a well-known entrepreneur, founder, audiocafe.com, author, Digital Vertigo, How Today's Online Social Revolution is Diminishing and Disorientating Us. He's also currently the host of Keen on the Show, the popular TechCrunch chat show, and a columnist for CNN, amongst other things. Paul Reeves, he's a senior technology manager at Dassault Systems SolidWorks R&D, former senior research, International Automotive Research Centre, University of Warwick, and he's written for publications including City AM, the Urban Design Journal, and Spiked Online. And last but not least, on my left is Anne-Marie Chulito, founder and CEO of Anarchic 3D, designer, maker, contemporary jeweler, author, digital crafts, industrial technologies for applied artists and designer makers. And she's very passionate about the power of making, particularly about the values and meaning of that applied artists and designers bring to their work through the use of tools, whether traditional and new. And me, I'm Martin Perks. I'm a management consultant and co-author of the Big Potatoes, the London Innovation Manifesto. So, you may have seen in the stall outside some examples of 3D printing. So I have a Dalek, I have a turbine, and there are many other objects that Anne has also kindly brought with us. So maybe you are not familiar with what 3D printing is all about. There's a very brief sort of introduction. I think it is everywhere. We have museum debates and exhibitions, currently the Design Museum, the Science Museum, they're both talking about it widely. Some predict the market will be worth over 4 billion in 2025. As it's known as additive technology, it works by building up successive layers of material over time that can really sort of challenge traditional manufacturing techniques because it's more precise, it uses less material, and even produces materials that could arguably be more stronger than traditional ways of kind of removing materials, subtractive manufacturing technology. So, many major manufacturers from automotive, aerospace, and so on are busily investigating why they should get more into 3D printing. But again, it's all over the shop. So Asda, you might have seen the story in the news this week, in Yorkshire, they're trialling 3D printing in their stores, where customers can come in, get a picture of themselves, or rather get their whole body scanned in as an avatar, if you like, and come back 2 days later, and they can take away their little model themselves to give to their loved ones or whoever else as a nice reminder of who they are. But further afield, the European Space Agency, they're also unveiling a large-scale plan to use 3D printing, in particular about constructing metal parts for aerospace and so on, and even for nuclear fusion projects, because it has great heat-resistant properties. Of course, elsewhere, even education, Michael Gove thinks that every school should have a 3D printer. So, some of the debate we need to talk about is, are we, sort of witnessing a new era of industrial kind of revolution, replacing how we once made things, or are we witness to more hype than kind of reality when it comes to 3D printing? Or even when it comes to giving more people the ability to make things themselves, because now you can kind of buy desktop printers, 3D printers for your home, are we actually democratizing how ideas and how objects are created away from the hands of industrialists and people with large-scale capital accounts and machinery? So are we seeing a dramatic change there? But even further afield, perhaps slightly away from the title of the subject of the session, are there ethical issues when it comes to 3D printing? So I mentioned maybe, in 60 minutes you could print a gun, because earlier the year there was a guy who produced a gun out of plastic which hid behind metal scanners called Liberator from a 3D CAD model, and that could be successfully printed. Of course, when he uploaded his designs to the web, over 100,000 people chose to also copy his gun design. So what are the ethics around 3D printing? Equally in the same sense, you can easily scan an object and claim it as your own and print it out for your own sort of fruition and pleasure. So what is to stop people kind of replicating ideas using this new technology? So, on one hand, we've got the scope about a new industrial revolution sort of impact, but equally there are perhaps large ethical issues when it comes to thinking about 3D printing. So, I will stop there, and I'm going to throw this over to the panel and see what they think. So first of all, and I will pitch this to Paul, because it's kind of his session to start with, are we witnessing a new industrial revolution? If so, where's it going to go?
I think the only sensible answer to that is it's too early to tell, but I guess that's not what you're looking for. I've thought about this a bit. One thing I'd like to sort of maybe make clear is the title is called 3D Printing, is it next industrial revolution? I think to talk about this subject more usefully, we're probably talking about digital manufacturing, so where we've had the intersection of computer-aided design and other digital computing techniques feeding into manufacturing, which has been going on for 50 years or so anyway. But I guess the difference is now with the internet and now that working networks pass things around, it's a whole different matter. So if we consider it from those terms, I guess I guess most people think of the Industrial Revolution as the classic one like portrayed in the Olympics last year, where there was steam power, there were chimneys, there was James Watt, there was all of this. But I think most if you consider the Industrial Revolution in those terms, you have to think about the other things that were going along in the areas of economics, in finance, law, people's relationship to God, all of these non-technology type things, where basically there was turmoil, things were changing, people were being thrown off the land or voluntarily leaving the land to sort of go to work in factories and stuff like this. So from that point, from that definition of is it a new industrial revolution, I'd probably say no. But then if you look at it, the actual industrial revolution in terms of maybe phases where you had steam and then electricity, etc., etc., it's possible that this could be the start of a new phase of an industrial revolution.
Okay.
But
Okay, I've got. Okay, well, maybe come back to your next point. I mean, who wants to agree with Paul, or even sort of debate the idea that actually we are in a new era of creativity and industrial revolution?
Can I go?
Sure.
I would term it more sort of, rather than revolution, just drop the R off it and just call it like an evolutionary process. Because it has been going on for quite a while. It has been sort of so based with industry for sort of prototyping. But it's only recently really that ordinary sort of people like myself can then start using it. I think it's the services that have actually sort of opened up the consumer side of it. And I think that, yes, it is going to be sort of quite a sort of hype on that side. Particularly people sort of buy the small 3D printers. I think that one of the barriers that is there is then how do you actually get your models for then 3D printing? And as we've talked about as to with scanning, and that is one way that it can be done. And that is one way that work is going to be copied, although it's not ideal. But yes, that is one way that the whole IP area is going to become very, very messy. So I would sort of put it really as this evolutionary process, because a lot of things have to be put into place or sort of knocked out of the equation, to get it to actually sort of be that new revolution. But I think the kids who are starting to use it now, it's actually going to really, the way that they start thinking is going to be very, very interesting. If they've got hands on these ways of making, I think it's going to make a big impact in that way. But again, evolution rather than revolution.
Okay. James?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Anne-Marie there. I think when we're talking about the 3D printing industry, we're actually talking about 2 to 3 different segments that have been merged over the last 2 to 3 years. Certainly the consumer 3D printing market, the low-end cost machines, I don't think we'll see a point where we'll see a printer in everyone's house, simply because after the hype, most people would run out of things to make. And also, the capabilities of these printers are being massively warped by the media at the moment, who are consistently blurring the lines between the capabilities of industrial machines and the capabilities of these low-end printers. So this has led to hugely inflated expectations about what these things are capable of doing. A brilliant quote that I recently heard from Dr. Phil Reeves, the economist, was consumer 3D printers are like typewriters with half the vowels missing. You could write a story that would make sense to the reader, but it would be a function of what the typewriter was capable of and not the creativity of the writer. On the additive manufacturing side, I can't see a point where we're going to see everyone go, right, tools down, we're now going to go to 3D printing. We've been casting for nearly 6,000 years. Why would we walk away from that learning? So I think at the moment, there's a specific set of criteria that need to be fulfilled for 3D printing to be a viable end manufacturing option. And as we see the barriers addressed, we'll see more and more OEMs use the technology as an end manufacturing option.
OEM is what?
Original equipment manufacturer.
Okay.
So, but in the next 5 to 10 years, we can see it that the 3D printing industry will see a larger share of the manufacturing market, but it won't become a majority.
Okay. Andrew, what's your take? Because I did read your sort of FT article earlier in the year where you sort of really started to kind of talk up the notion of kind of the software aspect of what 3D printing can kind of provide, I guess, in terms of cheapening productivity, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is a revolution. I think that I don't like the word evolution. I think it is a revolution in the sense, and it's like a lot of the things on the network. It reflects an increasing personalisation of production. Now, whether or not people are going to be able to have these machines in their homes that will spew out physical objects is not entirely clear. Certainly, it's not imminent, and whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 years. But there are other intermediary ways in which 3D printing can be effective. I mean, there are other business opportunities. What interests me about it is the economics, really, in the sense that I've seen the decimation of other industries, particularly the music industry and other areas of media, through the digital revolution, and I fear the same in some ways for 3D printing. I fear that what we'll see is the emergence, I mean, in spite of all this ideology of the democratization of production and the personalization of production, the reality is that you're going to see new dominant platforms which replace the old manufacturing industry, and that's what I'm actually rather fearful of in this revolution. I mean, even platforms like Etsy, I think, could threaten to become kind of monopolists here. And the challenge and the opportunity, I think, is to reinvent the idea of labour and of labour solidarity in the digital 21st century. It's clear that the physical solidarity of labour unions in the industrial age is now fairly historical. It's something of the past. But the challenge is how are the workers, the makers themselves, going to build their solidarity and protect themselves against the dominant platforms, whether they're Etsy or Google or Amazon or some imaginary company in the future.
I think that's really interesting kind of perspective, and it's kind of one of the things in my mind because, you know, for me, kind of the UK economy especially is no longer obviously a manufacturing economy. You know, we are predominantly service sector, and the thing we are good at, and especially good at exporting, is actually our design capability, which really falls into sort of computer-aided design, chip design, and so on. So I wonder if what you're saying, Andrew, and obviously everyone else comment, the cat is already out of the bag, and perhaps the reason why we're really sort of hyping up 3D printing now is because we don't necessarily in this country have a manufacturing sector of any significance to speak of anyway. So therefore 3D printing really fits the bill, as it were.
Yeah, I think it does in a way. So take one industry that I'm particularly intrigued in because my family used to be in this business is the clothing industry. So the traditional industrial manufacturing clothing industry was that a set of designers decided what we should all wear. And then we went to the stores and we bought those things. My family was actually in the dress, the do-it-yourself business, the sewing business. And their business went bankrupt as you had kind of mass commodification of clothing. But what you're going to see is that everyone's going to suddenly decide, well, why should I wear what some designer in Milan or New York or somebody else decides? I want to decide what colors, what shapes. I want to be able to design my own clothing. Now, I think in a sense that's an exciting prospect, in the same way as the rebellion against newspapers began when people said, I want to decide what I read, when I read it, and we're going to pull apart the old media industry. So the challenge then becomes in this new world is where the value is. Who is going to charge what? How are the designers actually going to be paid? What is the relationship between the consumer, which is us, and the product? Because in the media industry, you've seen, with this so-called democratization, you've seen increasing monopolies of data companies like Google, in particular, Facebook, Twitter. And I fear the same will happen with the clothing industry. So we've got to figure out ways that the designers themselves, and I agree with you, I think in Britain there could be a kind of renaissance of creativity because what Britain is very good at is design. But how does the model work? What are the economics? Who get paid for what?
Okay, let me leave it there, and I want to bring others in because it's a very interesting, important point. I mean, Paul, how do you kind of react to what Andrew is saying?
There's sort of several things with which
Try
try and stick to one. I mean, I suppose I feel slightly sad if, in a way, that we're talking about a new technology and it quite often comes up to be talked about in personalisation. You know, just producing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wanting something that's different from someone else, but I'm still wondering if it almost relates into the sort of thing with Facebook and Twitter. It's kind of quite me kind of thing. And obviously in the West in particular, that those kind of sentiments are reasonably sort of dominant. So I've got no problem with people setting up businesses, finding niches or whatever and going along that. But I would actually still myself like to see possibly more of an industrial context as opposed to a small business sort of context. That the technologies, both in terms of software and the things like additive manufacturing, actually to be used to build something like, say, for instance, off the top of my head, a new generation of supersonic aircraft or something like this, something that's got a bit more ambition than a different kind of shoe or dress or the equivalent of a super printed t-shirt, which is...
I mean, I'd argue that perhaps the personalisation thing can be applied to many different kind of industries, not just on the individual level, but also across market sectors too. But, come back to that. I mean, Anne, do you want to agree with the personalisation sort of thesis? It's a good thing?
Yes, I mean, very much so. But just sort of going back to what Sir Andrew was sort of talking about, is that actually often when you do something yourself, it actually makes you realise the quality that a craftsman, artist can actually put into something. You might not have actually understood that until you've actually tried it yourself. So, I think from my point of view as being a craftsman, that people actually trying to do it themselves, going to evening classes and so on, it's actually been very beneficial to me. because they've often then come back and actually bought my work because of the quality aspect of it, the value that I put into it. So, I think that there's all these sort of different sort of approaches to this whole area of personalisation. And I think that where, you can sort of choose to have something, either the colour that you want or the size or whatever, I think that that is, one way that we're actually going to build value into objects, which means that you're going to keep them longer. You're not going to sort of chuck them out after sort of one or two sort of uses. So I think that, on that sort of level, there's sort of huge sort of possibilities for all of us on that democratisation side. But I think that on the manufacturing side, I think that the whole sort of prototyping side, I think the thinking on that is going to change hugely as the 3D printing gets more and more sophisticated. And I think that particularly small design companies are actually going to be able to use it much more effectively now, whereas the costs have come down, makes a huge difference in how you actually iterate something, prototype at the earliest possible stage so that you're failing early, you're getting feedback early to sort of decide on which direction your product takes.
Okay, James, do you want to?
I've got one point on the personalisation, and I'll go into the prototypes where I know more about. But I think you're right with the artistic sort of science, but from where you're coming from, there is a huge opportunity for 3D printing. But if you look at all of the examples that Anne-Marie's brought with that, they're all produced on very expensive industrial machines. There's still a huge way to go on these personalised printers for them to match the capabilities of these machines. The fact is that these machines are only 5 years old. They still require a huge amount of development. I think eventually we will see even the consumer group split into a group aimed at school children and education, and this artistic segment with higher capabilities, higher material capabilities, and a higher associated higher cost. On the prototyping side, the industry has almost sort of kept itself quiet. I'm not sure many of you know, but it's actually 26 years old now, and Jaguar Land Rover has been using 3D printing for prototyping since 1992. This year we're set to produce 50,000 parts in the technology as well. It needs to kind of advertise itself more that it is a very established industry, especially in the UK and across Europe.
So, I've got two sort of final points to throw to the panel because we want to bring the audience in in say sort of 5 minutes time, but I still don't quite understand why now we're getting so excited about 3D printing, because as you say, it's sort of 20 odd years old. So what's happened over the last couple of years to make it kind of go mainstream, that supermarkets, you name it, are setting up their own printing presses, or 3D printers rather. And secondly, I sort of briefly mentioned the European Space Agency have now pumping lots of money into 3D printing. But what they also said in the story as reported, the other driver is of the kind of the green perspective, because for them they justify the research and investment because it produces less waste, less sort of material waste, it produces lighter objects. Is that partly one of the other reasons why perhaps 3D printing is starting to take off? Because it fits others' kind of more moral green agendas to make it more acceptable? What do you think? Anyone disagree with that or agree with that? Paul?
I've got lots of ideas of why it's happening. So I've been trying to get into it anyway. So
the best one.
Okay, right. I'd like to somehow get China into this discussion.
Okay.
Okay. And one of the this isn't why I really want to talk about China, but on anyway. But I get a feeling, as well as obviously, there's been the parallels with people like Chris Anderson, who wrote the book Makers, I think, sort of trying to use the parallel of the rise of PCs, blah blah blah, and saying, 3D printers, desktop, etc. I think with China, a lot of the reason companies like governments, Technology Strategy Board in the UK, even Obama in the States, they see additive manufacturing, the associated technologies, as being a way of reshoring industry in a kind of way. Now, whether it's successful or not, but I think that's one reason why governments, at least, it may be industrialists, are getting quite excited about it, because they see it as a way of boosting their industries, or creating employment, stuff like that. So that's just one of them.
Anyone else?
Yeah,
James, why now?
I think The main reason is 2009 fundamental FDM patent. It lapsed.
FDM is
Fused deposition modeling. It's the basis for all of these consumer 3D printers. And since then, we've seen 65 companies that have formed off the back of this. A lot of them formed out of the Bath RepRap program, which utilised open source software, open source materials. And really, by using open source, using all these open source things, they've democratized who can actually build a machine. I mean, anyone can start up a company and make their own 3D printer. What we're seeing now, as the market matures slightly, a company called MakerBot, who have just been taken over by Stratasys, had 70% of the market share before. The reason they had such popularity was they tapped into the social media side. So they've been using their users to develop their machines, which has massively increased the rate of development.
okay.
I think it's
Yeah.
in technology terms, everything is always timing, and so the fact that this thing has existed for a long time is not an argument to suggest it's not ready for prime time. I mean, the internet existed for 30 years before it became a major consumer phenomenon. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there are technological reasons why it's becoming ready for prime time, the MakerBot stuff. But I also think that entrepreneurs are ready for this now. You have a body of entrepreneurs, startup entrepreneurs that understand the opportunity here, and many of them will fail. Most of them will probably fail. And generation after generation will fail. I was an early internet entrepreneur in the mid-90s. My thing failed, and many music startups failed until you got iTunes and you got Spotify. So it takes a lot of failure for this thing to become a success. So I think the business community is ready. I think that venture capitalists and investors are ready. They're beginning to understand that this is a real market, and obviously a massive market. I mean, I don't know how many billions or trillions of dollars. But I think perhaps even more importantly than any of that, I think consumers are ready. I think consumers have been trained into this idea that things should be personalized. That there is nothing inevitable or necessary about them eating stuff or wearing stuff that somebody else made. So we're having this kind of collapse of the traditional consumer and producer. I wrote a book called The Cult of the Amateur back in 2007, and that phenomenon, I was critical of it, but that I think phenomenon is more and more sort of ingrained in our culture, more and more taken for granted. And so people are ready with these technologies, with the network, to make their own stuff, whether it's furniture or clothing or food.
Okay. Anne?
Well, I think one of the other sort of elements that comes into this, that's sort of spurring this growth, is crowdfunding. So a lot of the companies that are coming up with the sort of their own 3D printers, they're actually sort of being funded within the different crowdfunding platforms. There's also, there's the consumer side where you've got your own 3D printer. There's also the service industries. So I actually use the service industries to get my stuff 3D printed because they are industry quality printers, which means that what I am printing becomes the end product that I actually sell. Whether it's things like this, which is 3D printed metal, 3D printed titanium, sort of my brooch is polyamide. I'm actually sort of using those services, and it's just so easy. You just upload your model to their website. You can choose which material. It tells you the cost of it. You can scale it up and down. You press print, and you get it in sort of maybe 10 working days. So that has spurred a whole load of designer makers to actually go and sort of use 3D printing, to explore it, experiment with it.
Okay. I personally found that very useful in the space of 15-20 minutes. We seem to have covered a massive amount of ground already. So now it's your turn as the audience. So we've got about 25 plus minutes for you to have your say, to kind of disagree, agree, or make your own points. I'm going to take kind of rounds of questions and points, and then we'll get hopefully the speakers in for a couple of times to comment and to come back on you. So I'll start with yourself down front. Yeah. I'm gonna. If you keep your hands up, I'll try and take a note of who you are.
I'd like to ask, this has been quite technology focused, and I know that's kind of what the motion is. But I want to ask, is there can it be applied to fields other than like consumer goods and mechanics, so like science? Could you have really like organs being printed, and would that then revolutionise that field? And also on the back of that, is there a restriction to the material that can be put into the 3D printer?
Okay, did everyone hear that? Yeah, good. Guy here to the right. And if you keep your hands up, then I can take note of you.
Hello, I'd just like to give you an example I think cuts across what everybody's been saying. In terms of the personalisation, I bought a little Chinese motorbike last week, a little 125, and it's an English company that designs them all from a huge array of available parts that can be produced. Now, they're all low tech and low cost. So at the moment, although you can choose from about 25 different models essentially assembled from a very large parts bin in the Chinese factory, they're using the technology of the internet and digital design to actually soon much more personalise it so that the customer themselves will be able to go and choose all the various bits and paint and bits and bobs that go on your little motorbike yourself. Now this is not high-tech manufacture. The high-tech is being used to order something from a factory in China that's sort of powered on coal, blood, tears, that kind of a thing. And this is really not about democratising anything, but it does perhaps also point the way in which the kind of design expertise in the West and the manufacturing bases of the East could be combined in a quite different way that frankly goes a lot past what a lot of you have been talking about.
Okay, thank you. At the back, there's two hands up there. Yeah.
I noticed that two different people on the panel had a conflicting sort of opinion about what's going to happen to manufacturing. On the one hand, I heard that manufacturing is going to be an industry that's destroyed by 3D printing, in the same way as the music industry and the media industry is struggling against the internet. On the other hand, I've got that 3D printing could be a way to steal manufacturing industry back from China to the Western countries. I'd just like to see a bit of an argument as to what 3D printing will do to manufacturing.
Okay, there's a guy next to you, front with the greyish jumper, I think, or shirt.
Sort of off the back of that, when do you think that 3D printing will become a viable manufacturing option for big industrialised companies, if at all?
Thank you. There's a guy down the front with the pink colour shirt. Excuse my colour descriptions.
I'm wondering how you're thinking our attitudes to design are going to change, especially, I think, James, you mentioned MakerBot and how user feedback was helping change the design of that. How rather than democratization of manufacturing, perhaps we're democratizing innovation such that the service industry can improve things. I'm thinking things like direct injection engines was originally invented by a farmer for his tractor engine, and has since probably picked up in the last 70 years. But the internet has allowed us to share these ideas. Potentially people will try them at home and then share them such a big industry can produce them in a economically viable way.
Okay, and the guy next to you, and then I'll take the lady down there, and then the panel, you can come back on some of these points. Yeah.
You mentioned the FDM patents, which I think Stratasys held. Is that right? Okay. And Stratasys buying up MakerBot. Is there a concern that future developments in additive manufacturing techniques will get patented and then will hamper the development of the whole industry?
Okay, the lady down front, and then panel, you want to come back on some of these points?
Hi, my question goes more in the green agenda direction. I recently watched a video in TED Talk about modern metal that is kind of proposing meat and leather 3D printing production. So I wanted to know your opinion about this and what the environmental sustainability and development impacts would be of this kind of technologies.
Okay, thank you. So panel, do choose to what you want to come back on. Try and keep it fairly brief because we want to get more questions in. So who wants to pick up some of these points? James?
Just on the FDM Stratasys patents, the MakerBot company kind of patented themselves as this glorified, we're saving the world by making everything open source. The year before they were taken over, they actually started filing patents themselves and filed 7 before they were taken over. the fact that they have been taken over now will actually increase the development of these low-end consumer printers, primarily because they have access to Stratasys' 20 years of experience with the technology. So next year we're likely to see machines coming out with the heated build oven, soluble supports, which will actually increase the capability of these machines massively. So I think, if anything, it's going to push the development.
Okay.
It is really interesting, the business landscape. I'm still waiting for one of the major players in technology to really invest in this space seriously. So a 3D printer from HP or Apple. And perhaps the fact there isn't one yet suggests that we're still in the very, very early stages, that still the technology doesn't exist to make something viable. Because look at the music industry. I had a startup in the mid-90s. We all knew that music was going to the cloud. We all knew that music would go on digital devices, but it didn't happen. There were lots of little startups. They all failed. Kind of like the 3D space now. And it took Apple and Jobs and a massive investment in design and infrastructure to make the thing real. So I suspect that it will take a major player. Maybe, I mean, Google is very well positioned in this. Google's already massively invested in self-driving cars and a number of other things. I'm actually kind of surprised that Google hasn't made a play here. Yeah, again, perhaps because it's not ready yet.
Okay.
So I'm sort of bring up on the personalisation side, and with, what I think one of the things that has worried quite a lot of people is that people will 3D print things at home to maybe sort of construct, say, like a small motorbike or something like that, and that part will then fail. Who is then actually responsible for the sort of the injuries and what sort of insurance, etc. And I think that these are the sort of questions that are actually going to be debated over the next sort of few years as to how you actually can regulate that side of it. It was quite interesting when I went to into iMaker. The guys there were actually designing things to go on bicycles, but they're actually doing some really quite neat things. One of the things was to go on your handlebars was a little mirror, that was actually quite nicely sort of placed so you could actually sort of see behind you. So I mean, those things are fine, but it's when you actually come to sort of the actual construction of parts, that's where I think that there has to be some area of sort of regulation, and also to understand what are the constraints and limitations of materials. One of the things that nobody's actually mentioned so far is, I think I did a little bit, is about the software. There are sort of barriers to consumer entry, but you can also go onto a place like sort of Thingiverse and quite a number of other hubs where you can actually download models that you can then sort of 3D print, or go and have 3D printed at one of the services. So there are some areas of sort of regulation, and certainly I think Thingiverse have just come out with where they're going to verify designs. So I mean that would then be taken sort of further.
I would always contest, though, that surely regulation is a barrier to innovation right now as well.
Yes.
Surely we need less regulation, not more. So I'm surprised that you're potentially arguing that we need to...
I'm not arguing that in some ways that we should have it, because I think I'm a little bit rebellious. I'm one of these people who I'm sort of like just a good enough mother. I kind of my kids actually did do things that they actually learned quite quickly that they shouldn't do.
Okay. Paul, how do you answer some of these questions, and maybe also the green comment as well?
That was the one I hadn't really got.
Okay, move on to another one.
This business of will additive technologies replace existing manufacturing? In my view, it does change day to day, is that it needs the big, well-funded companies to do an awful lot of the really serious R&D that's needed in things like new materials, how materials are laid down, even the print heads and stuff like that. That is a, if you think of a print head on even just a laser print or whatever, like there's millions of pounds going into research to do that. It's high its high precision, etc. You can multiply that total number of times with, if you're printing materials, you've got 4 colours with a printer, you've got an unlimited number of materials for a physical thing. So it kind of connects a bit to Andrew's point. So I kind of see the analogy with music being digitised and video, but I do think it's an extra level of barrier to actually reproduce, design, or whatever things that are in the physical world. There's an added layer of so that might just delay it for a bit longer. But I think we can't just knock off the big companies and say they're going to be supplanted by the new upstarts, because I think a lot big companies like Bosch and all of the German chemicals companies and stuff like that, they're going to be the ones that are going to actually deliver a lot of this technology. So I see a core of traditional manufacturing that's not personalised, but then a bit of a surface of the more personalised sort of stuff, which I guess is a bit like the chap at the front was saying about China. Now, China again, I'll get it in at the end, I won't do it in. So.
I think it's a really interesting point about the big. Because when I think of it, I live in America, and all Americans are very America-centric. You all know that, of course. And we just assume the world is America and big companies are American. But when it comes to manufacturing, for example, America isn't really the dominant player, and Germany is, or maybe Germany on the high end and China on the low end. So it would be really interesting if you've got true innovation and massive investment from either German startups or pre-existing German or Chinese manufacturing companies. And I think that would be actually very good for the digital economy, is if you've got startups outside America that pioneered new fields. I think it would be good for the sort of the global digital economy not to have everything centered in America.
But isn't that the way that it's going anyway? Because one of the big sort of drivers in economic terms is sort of direct foreign investment. So even in the UK, we're seeing lots of our utilities and companies sort of being bought out and funded by the Chinese and so on. So perhaps what you're talking about there is already sort of well underway anyway, as a sort of an economic trend.
Well, Britain's not going to be a leader unless it's a designer, right?
Sure. Look, so let's get some more questions from yourselves in the audience, because we've spoken quite a lot again. So keep your hands up, and I'll nod when I've registered your hand. We'll start off with the guy in the maroon shirt.
A lot of the news stories have kind of said everyone will have their own 3D printer, they'll have them in their house, they'll print whatever they like out. So I was interested to hear that even someone who designs their own designs to be made then sends them to a service company to have them printed out. So if even people who have the time and the expertise to design things are doing that, why would anyone who's just buying a part off the internet that someone else has designed print it in their home? And if they're going to have a part that someone else has designed and someone else has manufactured, is it not just the same as if they bought it off Amazon anyway?
Okay. Guy down the front here.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's almost 2 debates about 3D printing going on in parallel. One is about the reality of 3D printing and the ins and outs of the technology, and then the parallel one is about the symbolic value of 3D printing, which to me seems to be like an implicit critique of things like scale, and it seems to be an implicit critique of stuff and lots of stuff. So I wondered if it's captured the public imagination, because it seems to be a way out of that kind of big consumerist, big technology, all of those things. I wondered if you could comment on that a bit.
Okay. Sorry, we have to run around a bit. Guy here, yeah.
Going back to what the young woman in the blue shirt asked, I think about artificial organs being printed with 3D printing. I've read somewhere that there's currently medical research being done about using 3D printing to print basically stem cells onto pre-existing clean organs like pig's hearts, and then using the stem cells for rejection-free transplants. And I was just wondering if the panel has any more information concerning that.
Okay. There was a guy behind, yeah, still want to speak?
Thanks. I was wondering whether the panel think that there are any parallels or contrasts with the rise of 2D printing and the home industry with that, in that there are more accurate alternatives to printing at home that you can send off for, but people still use the slightly more shoddy home printers because there's a massive convenience to it, and also there's a lot of industry interest.
Okay, there's a guy to your right.
Hi. Yeah, I think it's useful to make a distinction between the consumer and education applications of the technology and the industrial applications of the technology. So what's changed, I think, for the first group is that the technology, it's been around 25 years or so. It's got quicker, cheaper, smaller, wider range of materials. I think that largely explains why it's got down to a level where schools and individual hobbyists can afford it. So I think that explains that, but I don't think that's anything to do with any talk of industrial revolution. So then if you get to industry, I'm quite involved in this area, and everyone who's seriously involved in manufacturing kind of rolls their eyes when they hear all about the hype, because they integrated it into their manufacturing in the 90s. But what's new about it in industry is it's being used for finished parts, so additive manufacturing rather than prototyping. And I think what's interesting about there is that it's got uses in very small specialist cases. So take health. I think it's really exciting in health, printing organs, printing bones, all that kind of stuff. I think there's all sorts of little niches like in aerospace and all the rest of it. So I think I think it's worth being specific about. Yeah, it could revolutionise certain areas, but in terms of a cross-sector industry revolution, I think it's instructive that Peter Marsh, who's written the book, the ex-FT manufacturing journalist, who's written the book on the future of manufacturing, hardly mentions the technology.
Okay, there's a couple of hands at the back, and then I'm going to bring the panel in. So there's a guy on the right, yeah, hand up there.
I just wanted to put the focus a little bit on the usage on industry and aftermarket, for instance. Nowadays we have the industry having a huge problem. We have stocks and stocks of machines and specific tooling which we want to get rid of. If we can, for a cheap price, print those, and still go with our law, compliance, which we have to sell the part for 10, 15, 20 years. If we have that as a model and can send it to the customer at 15 years later, 20 years later, then this is a huge benefit for them. Therefore, the industry itself is, I think, working on that, but of course, low quantities, high price, but still you can get it. You can get it if you have to on ISS or wherever. You just need the part, you have to have the specification, that's all that you need. Even in the field for the army and so forth, and so that I just want to put the focus on that.
This guy just there, and we'll bring the panel back very quickly and get a couple more questions if I can.
Yeah, I just want to, obviously there's a number of markets at play here, and what's not really been mentioned here is price tag, and for quite a number of those markets, the mass market, it's ultimately price tag. How it's actually manufactured is almost irrelevant, and if you imagine the graph and you go over to the right hand side, specialism kicks in and price premium, the premium market for specialist activities, health, etc., become relevant. So surely, in terms of cutting through the hype, it's actually price tag and the ability to challenge that price tag, and can really 3D printing challenge the price tag of a source pan.
Okay, and my kind of little question to the panel, we might have covered it slightly already, but surely the benefit of 3D printing is in this ability to kind of create effective prototypes. You can, wireframe on your computer, and very quickly you can have a physical object printed out before you. And of course, the tactile object is much better than something on the screen. So surely its impact is quite big potentially, because it will mean we design and conceive things in a far different way, a more speedier way than we can ever do now with a piece of paper and a pen and a mouse. So surely there is quite a large impact on what it could bring, but maybe it's too early to call. We have to wait a while before we perfect the technology evermore. So anyway, that's my bit, but who wants to kind of come back on some of these points? Anne, do you want to start?
There's a couple of things that sort of pull some of these things together.
Brief, because I want to get a couple more.
Okay. There was this mention of sort of the medical side, and one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is like the personalised prosthetics, you know, where they actually do fit properly. And I think that's made a huge difference to, you know, the people who have actually been getting those. Now, one of the other big industries that I think is actually quite quiet is hearing aids. You know, apparently there's it's a huge industry now to actually sort of scan inside your ear and get a fitting that fits properly. You know, it really is major.
Okay, sorry to kind of make it brief, but
just to follow on from Ruth's point, with the inner hearing aid, it's a brilliant example of where the industry actually fits. If you look at what a hearing aid is, it's very small and requires it to be very personalised to the end user. On the size, if you think of the average size of a build platform on an industrial printer, you're talking around 500mm by 500mm. So in a hearing aid, I can get a huge amount onto one build. So the cost of producing one part on that build is tiny. If I start going to larger parts, you can fit less of them on one build, but it still takes you the same amount of time to print those parts. So the actual cost is significantly increased for your manufacturing side.
Okay, cool. Just one point you make.
One and a quarter. Just on almost your point, Martin, about prototype and stuff. I mean, I think ultimately, you know, this could go any way, but on a good day, I think this is a technology that could produce effectively new materials. They're not made out of the same chemicals, but you can imagine some super lightweight cell-like material that you could build super lightweight aircraft that could go at supersonic speeds and not burn up and stuff like that. So, you know, if you let your imagination go wild, you know, it could sort of go that way. And that's kind of connected. I know I didn't answer it before, but I actually kind of refuse to consider green issues with this technology because I'm worried that sustainability and green arguments can actually kill new technology. New technologies are generally inefficient and dirty to start with. Later on they may get better, but I kind of try and just avoid the discussion about green stuff. It may be useful, but ultimately I think we need to use the new technologies like this to actually think bigger, not think smaller.
Just quickly on that point. 3D printing isn't green. On SLA, the stereolithography process, the original process, we work on the basis of 100% wastage. And on FDM, almost 50% of the part that you produce is support material, which is then dissolved in water and thrown away.
Okay, Andrew, come back briefly.
Yeah, there's a really interesting new book out called Average is Over by an American economist called Tyler Cowen, who argues that the future of technology is a kind of human algorithm partnerships, that the algorithm won't be dominant, that we're not going to have robots. For the robots to be really intelligent, you need human beings to manage them and organize them and develop them. And I think the same is going to be true with 3D printing. I think there's an interesting business opportunity for designers and manufacturers to stand between traditional manufacturer and the consumer. And that's, I think, perhaps where the revolution will begin, of people being able to come to the consumer and saying, look, you know, furniture or clothing, these are things we understand you're frustrated with the traditional retail environment. We can offer stuff which is way more personalized and to your taste. But the idea of these machines sitting in people's homes and spewing out furniture or clothing, I think in the short term isn't very realistic.
Okay, I am aware of the time I shall get told off, so I've got about 2 minutes, so I can take like one final kind of point if anyone is desperate to say anything. Otherwise, I'll ask Al to come back again and tell me what they make of the whole discussion. All right, one point there, and then
I'll shout it out.
Well, wait for the microphone because we're, I believe, recording.
It's just one big cheer for the imaginative potential that this technology has. accepting all the points about the limitations and its slow integration into the mainstream as a working technology, the limitation to its fully industrialised production of finished end products. But the real potential, I think, is in the design on the design boundary, and it is because it introduces greater precision at a higher level of complexity, with levels of sophistication for the ranges of materials possible, but with a new generation of designers coming through, and the public's acceptance of it. I think the potential is there.
Okay, thank you. I would like the panel in the last remaining minute to kind of conclude with any final thoughts, but it has to be very quick, I'm afraid. So, you know, are we in a new era of industrial revolution, or perhaps, as Andrew and others said, it's more focused around personalisation, kind of like market?
I think yes, it's evolving. I think it's very, very exciting, particularly for people like myself, being makers, because I can see a lot more people getting involved in actually making and doing, whether it's with their own machines or whether they're going to services. Yeah, I think that's very, very exciting.
Thank you. James?
I think on the consumer side, there's still a lot of development work that's needed, but we will see a larger audience using these machines. But yeah, it's going to be limited to the artistic side, the startup entrepreneurs, certainly not in everyone's household.
Fantastic.
Back to China again, I suppose. I think that depending on what goes on in China and how sort of socially it changes and is dynamic or not, that actually could add another dimension to how these kind of technologies are used. It's not just the technology, it's the IT and stuff like that. But I just get a feeling when you've got economies that are growing relatively fast, you can get different ideas than ones that are relatively stagnant ideas like we've got in the UK. The only other comment, the only other thing I'd like to mention is I think it's useful to talk about business to business in a lot of these things. A lot of benefits are going to come from business to business, and we shouldn't always be talking about the consumer. I know business is a consumer, but I think capital, basically going through the whole production system and design system, whatever you want to call it, is an important thing.
And lastly, Andrew, any final?
Yeah, I think that this is a truly magical technology. The idea that machines can replace factories and that that anyone can just create anything is a magical technology. I think there is an appetite both in the business and in the consumer sectors for magical technologies. And I think there's a certain inevitability about this technology. The question again is timing. I think Anna Maria opens up an important and relevant point. The really interesting thing, I'm less interested in the technology, more interested in the politics and economics of this. The really interesting thing is what will happen to the hobbyist. The hobbyist drove the original digital revolution and were essentially left with nothing as the internet economy has a tendency towards monopolization and the existence of a tiny group of companies that have created huge amount of wealth for themselves and their share owners, but for very few other people. So the really interesting story in this is whether you can get a viable economy, a mass economy, that will come out of the hobbyist community. And I think movements like the Maker Movement, Dale Doherty and Sebastopol, who runs the Maker magazine and Maker events, it'd be interesting to see whether they can build viable, real businesses out of the hobbyists.
Okay, that's a great point to end on. So can we give our panel a good round of applause?